Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country, around the world, and especially inside Ukraine, Happy New Year. The year is picking off hot and heavy right where it left off. And this show is going to continue to keep our focus on the most important story of our time, the war in Ukraine. And returning to kick off a new year of conversations is one of my favorite conversations from last year, one of the most important guests we had on from last year, an inspiring, dynamic, insightful guy. The great and powerful Nolan Peterson is back on Independent Americans. Welcome back, my friend.
Thank you for having me back. Glad to be here.
So I guess I can't, you're in Ukraine, so I can't say Happy New Year. I guess I want to wish you a victorious New Year. What's the New Year wish in Ukraine right now? What do you wish to other people inside Ukraine right now?
Well, I'd say without a doubt, the New Year's wish here is for victory, not just for the war to end, but for Ukraine to be victorious and to get back all of its land that it lost after the February 24th full-scale invasion, but most importantly, to liberate the Ukrainians who are living under what is a very brutal Russian occupation in the southern and eastern parts of the country that Russia has taken over. The New Year holiday, I think it was quite symbolic in a way. On New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, Russia launched waves of missile and drone strikes against Ukraine, primarily here in Kyiv, and it was just absolutely surreal for me to, just minutes after midnight, to hear the explosions of air defenses going off and to run to the bomb shelter where I met a group of young people who, transferred their party from an apartment downstairs. And it's just a surreal way to live. War has just kind of permeated every level of life here in Ukraine. And I think that people are committed to victory. They believe in their cause. They know it's just. But I think there is also sort of a somber, sober appreciation for the fact that this war isn't going to end anytime soon. And that 2023 will likely be another very hard and very trying year for the Ukrainian people.
Mm. Nolan, your reporting has been indispensable. I've been trying to give lift to it as much as I could since you joined us last time in May. It's been a while, and I hope this year we can talk more regularly. But you had a post where you said, New Year, same war. And I want to go deeper into that. I want to get your thoughts on Zelensky's visit. I want to talk about some of the military dynamics because your vantage point is unique, not just because you're there, but also because you're an American combat veteran with that experience. But let me ground us in the question that I ask of everyone. Where are you, as much as you can tell us exactly, and how are you, man?
Yeah. Well, I am in my apartment here in Kyiv, the capital city of Ukraine. And as you can see, we have power tonight. We have internet. The heating is on. So despite Russia's determined attack against Ukraine's power grid, we're still operating over here as usual. I'm doing okay. It's been a hell of a year. Like you mentioned, I'm a veteran of the U.S. Air Force. I was a pilot in special operations, served in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then I embarked on a career as a war correspondent after I left the military. But this year, I mean, it's just been, for me personally, a completely sort of alien experience to go through a war, not as a combatant or simply a witness like I was as a journalist, but to be somebody whose family is caught up in the war, to sit in my apartment and listen to artillery, to sit at home where I am with my wife and to hear gunfire outdoors and to hear Russian missiles, cruise missiles landing in our neighborhood just blocks away, to fear for my wife's life. I mean, it adds a whole nother layer to my understanding and appreciation of war that I rarely felt serving in the U.S. military, because our wars, obviously we're halfway around the world. So I think that, this year I really have learned to appreciate and have a lot of empathy for the civilians whose lives are upheaved by this war or any other.
Nolan, I want to go deep into that because you've been writing about it and doing video about it. But I want to start with kind of a top line here. You track on the U.S. media, you're active on Twitter. To start this off, what do you think the American public specifically is missing? When you're over there walking around and you're reporting and you could scream from the mountaintops and you want everyone to understand this is what you're missing. Maybe it's one thing, maybe it's multiple things, but Nolan, what do you think the American public is missing about what's happening in Ukraine now?
I don't think many Americans understand how much our country has inspired the dream that Ukrainians hold on to, the dream that drives them to fight so hard for their democracy. We serve as this example for them, that they have seen our country through primarily the young generation, through media, through social media, through the news, and they've grown up with this vision of what they want in their lives, and it is largely the vision of what we sort of have grown to take for granted in the United States. So we really have, just by our values, inspired the Ukrainian people to fight for democracy, to fight for their freedom. And in 2014, nearly 9 years ago now, Ukrainians, mainly driven by the passions of the young people, took to central Kyiv and overthrew a pro-Russian regime because they wanted to live in a democracy. They wanted to make their country less corrupt. They wanted to adopt Western values, and they wanted to be entrepreneurs. And for the last 9 years now, Russia has tried to kill those dreams, but Ukrainians are still fighting for it. So it's not only, American weapons which are fueling Ukraine's ability to defend itself, but it's also our example of a democracy that is fueling their desire to not give up and to keep fighting so that they can achieve what we already have.
We've talked to so many people in the last year on this show that have had different perspectives. Adrian and Irina Brunbauer, had a family component. Yeah. We had Matt Gallagher on, and I know he's recently gone again and is working on some more stuff about that. But can you break apart from where you sit? I want to talk about Zelensky and get your thoughts on that. But the actual military component, because it's evolved, right? Like first it was the javelins were like, on the wish list, right? And the javelins hit the battlefield and changed the battlefield. Then it was HIMARS, right? And HIMARS hit the battlefield and things have changed. Now Patriot missile batteries are en route. And it feels like next on the list is tanks and fighter planes. All of which, if it were up to me, I would have sent in the beginning. But there's this kind of demented game of Mother May I going on between Zelensky and the American Congress. Can you talk about the impact you've seen, given your special operations experience, of these American weapon systems on the battlefield and what you think needs to come next? There's a debate about, aircraft in particular, about tanks in particular. How do you assess the impact of those phases and what do you think needs to come next?
Well, I think to begin with, I totally disagree with our current sort of, I don't know if you want to call it our strategy or whatever, but the procedure of slowly rolling out additional weapon systems over time. If we had given Ukraine what they had asked for originally, the war, they might be a lot closer to winning the war right now than they currently are. Mm-hmm. So I think if we're going to be, if as President Biden said, we're going to stand by Ukraine to the end of this thing, why not just give them what they need now? Because I think in many wars, sort of the ultimate sin is to allow the war to drag on for an unnecessary amount of time. And so the more we can give Ukraine now, the more they're able to sort of continue their advantage, continue their momentum, which they began to achieve in the summer with their counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson. They can continue that momentum and potentially push Russia back to the February 24th borders, or conceivably even the 1991 borders when Ukraine became an independent state from the Soviet Union. They can do that before Russia is able to fully leverage the power of the mobilization program currently underway. Russia has already mobilized 300,000 troops. A lot of talk here in Ukraine that Russia is about to mobilize another 500,000 troops. So time is not on Ukraine's side. They need to achieve victory as fast as possible before Russia can just start pumping more soldiers at the fight. And I think we look at the fighting in Soledar and Bakhmut right now, where Russia, has these basically human wave attacks, which are just throwing bodies at the Ukrainians. I think that is a bellwether for the way the war is going to go in 2023. So we need to give Ukraine as much as we possibly can, as fast as possible, so they can end this thing quickly. Obviously, at the beginning of the war, the javelins had a huge impact. Ukraine was fighting smart, very mobile, these little tank hunter units, but also artillery had a very important role to play in the beginning. I think that's been a little bit downplayed because we all glamored by the effect that javelins had, and that was not insignificant. But also here in Kyiv, I mean, it was primarily an artillery battle, and the Ukrainians hammered the invading Russians. The Ukrainians were able to kind of stall the Russian advance, I think, with the javelins, but then artillery really took over. So yes, HIMARS made a huge impact, allowed Ukrainians to, in the battle for Kherson, to kind of just very methodically destroy the Russians' supply depots and their routes of egress out of the right bank side of Kherson. So yes, as we look forward now to 2023, where this war unfortunately could devolve into more and more of this grinding war of attrition, potentially marked by another massive Russian offensive once they get those hundreds of thousands of conscripts ready for combat. Ukraine's going to need some hardware. And so I think that as we look forward, armored fighting vehicles, tanks, things like that will certainly be essential to the Ukrainians. Ammunition, artillery, shells are going to be extraordinarily important so they can maintain the rate of fire on the battlefield, and also air defenses. Russia has embarked on this strategic air campaign of missile and drone strikes to destroy Ukraine's power grid, to terrorize civilians. And to date, Ukraine's air defenses have done an extraordinary job. And absolutely, I don't think anybody would have expected February 24th that Ukraine would be shooting down, almost 100% success rate at this point with the Shahids, the Iranian exploding drones that Russia is using, but a very high rate of success against cruise missiles too. So in order to maintain that rate of success and keep the lights on, Ukraine's going to need more and more air defense support as well.
Nolan, are people pissed about this? Are you pissed about this? I mean, I'm pissed about it, right? Like the idea that Zelensky is in the war for freedom and he has to come hat in hand and beg and plead for one off, two off, give me this, give me that. I mean, it's this double-edged sword where Ukrainians are grateful and they're celebrating American involvement, but they're being treated like children, right? It's got a patronizing feel to it that doesn't sit right with me. And if I were in Congress or I were in the White House, I would definitely handle it differently. But there's got to be frustration because you're like deep in a knife fight over there and people back home are playing games saying, oh, maybe we'll send you Bradleys. And I think it also cuts to the core of lack of understanding of how deep and broad and brutal this kind of combat is. And just what combat is, right? You got a lot of people in Congress who haven't served. They don't know the difference between an Abrams tank and a Bradley. But does it piss people off? I feel like they're biting their tongue a little bit because, you don't want to bite the hand that feeds, which is a demented dynamic that's been created. But how do people feel and how do you feel?
Well, I think, I can't speak for the Ukrainian nation, but from the people I know, the soldiers and civilians, with whom I communicate with my family. My father-in-law is a former Soviet soldier and my uncle-in-law, Soviet soldier who served in Afghanistan. I say without a doubt, Ukrainians are extraordinarily grateful for the support that our country has given, both economically, military, across the board. It's a little bittersweet sometimes, I have to admit, when we provide, or we say okay, now we're going to provide Patriots. And now there's many months of training ahead before the Patriots can be put into use. Why didn't we do that on day one?
Yeah.
Then now Patriots would be defending Kyiv and Kharkiv and other major cities in Ukraine, and many more civilian lives would be spared if we had done these things on day one. I remember when the war started, Ukraine immediately started asking for Western fighter jets. And the main argument against it was, it'll take 6 months or a year to train them. Well, here we are, almost a year later. Ukraine could conceivably be fielding F-16s at this point if we had made the decision earlier. And so, to me, it just doesn't jive, to be honest. When we say, on the one hand, we're going to be with Ukraine until victory, we're not going to back down. We've got, sort of unbreakable support for Ukraine. But then we slow roll all these things. It's why are we slow rolling? Let's just end the war as fast as possible. And I think that by slowly ratcheting up on our support, we actually give Russia the latitude to counter-escalate, to escalate in time with us. But if we just provided Ukraine the amount of hardware they need to prosecute a very fast victory and to continue these counteroffensives, Russia wouldn't be able to get his shit together and
Yeah.
escalate in turn. So I think that what we're seeing now, as Russia mobilize hundreds of thousands of troops, probably has plans to do more, to execute an additional mobilization. Russia, they're going out buying artillery shells from North Korea, buying exploding drones from Iran. Russia has the time now to get
Hmm.
its act together and to
Hmm.
carry on this like brutal war of attrition. But they have that time because we never gave Ukraine what they needed initially to
Right.
win this thing faster.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's like, it's kind of like, walking out early on a game and then seeing somebody blow the lead. This is so far from over, but it
Yeah.
can be so much closer to over if we open the floodgates, right? I feel like, we're standing in front of the gun closet that is the Pentagon saying, okay, you can have one of these, but not one of these yet. You can see it back there, but you can't have one yet. And I think there's been an underestimated component of this, which is Ukraine has become for the American military the national training center on steroids. All our
Yeah.
tactics, all our weapons, all our technology is being tested in the best possible way possible to benefit our own national defense. And I think I've been reading the statistics, maybe 5% of our defense budget is being allocated to Ukraine. We've taken out 50% of military capacity in Russia. So
Right.
if you would have said a couple of years ago, hey, we can take out 50% of one of our top two or three enemies for 5%, that seems like a pretty good return on investment. So as a military veteran, when you see it, and maybe I'll pivot into another part of this. You see folks on the right. You see Marjorie Taylor Greene, and I don't even want to invoke their name, except I know they're being seen by Ukrainians as well. And people must be saying, like, what the fuck is up with these people? You see these people, calling Zelensky, a criminal, saying that they're just in it for the money. Can you talk about that piece of this? Because I think it has more to do with like American insecurity and our problems with Iraq and Afghanistan and maybe even Vietnam than it has to do with the realities of what Ukraine is facing. So I know that's a couple things packed into one, but I feel like you're in a unique position to unpack a lot of that.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, after the war began, my Twitter following went from about 30,000 to now 550,000.
Right.
And because of that, every time I see these idiotic comments from certain personalities, media personalities and political, lawmakers in the United States, I get this itch to just vent, but I rarely do. I think it's always better to just make declarative statements about the truth rather to get involved in these back and forths.
Mm.
But to your point, I think as Americans, we're spending a lot of money in Ukraine. I think it's totally acceptable and right to have honest conversations about the utility of this aid. How is it in America's interest? I get that. Like I live here in Ukraine. I'm emotionally invested. My family's here. For me, it's a moral duty. But to many Americans, it's a very abstract concept, very abstract conflict potentially. And so I think President Biden probably could do a better job to explain why this war is in America's national interest, the moral duty we have to support Ukrainians. What I don't understand, though, is okay, if you want to question the utility of the aid to Ukraine, that's fine. If you're a lawmaker, that's your responsibility to spend America's tax dollars wisely. But why do you have to denigrate Ukraine? Why do you have to insult Ukraine's wartime leader? Why do you have to claim that Ukraine isn't a democracy or to regurgitate some Kremlin propaganda about biolabs, which has no validity whatsoever, or to say that Ukraine's 2014 revolution was a CIA-backed coup, which is just profoundly untrue. It was a grassroots revolution prosecuted by Ukraine's civilian population that caught our country by surprise. Ukrainians chose this path for themselves, and Russia unilaterally decided that no, we're gonna basically insert Ukraine as we have for hundreds of years. And Russia decided that Ukraine doesn't have the agency to chart its own future. And I just don't think, like, in today's world, that sets a very dangerous precedent. And I think, as we look toward China and Taiwan, we can't allow a country like Russia to just, to decide that it doesn't like the course of its neighbor's future and to just invade, and not just invade, by the way, but Russia's army is, raping and murdering its way across Ukraine. This is not just some sterile, limited warfare. This is a brutal war of just the carnage is almost incomprehensible.
Yep.
And I think maybe since the last time we've talked, I was in Bucha and Irpin after the Russian pullback from the outskirts of Kyiv, and to see all the dead bodies on the streets and to see Russia's crimes, to look in the eyes of women who have been raped by Russian soldiers, and then you turn around and you see American lawmakers entertaining the notion that maybe this is a propaganda stunt or something like that. It's just, it's
It's
almost
sick.
no words to describe it.
Sick,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, but it's also like the unfortunate part of our political normal back in America, and I think that's why your voice and others are so critical that are on the ground to kind of pierce through the bullshit, because I do think the country and the world sees the truth, and you and others have been heroic in sharing that truth. No one more than the Ukrainian people. But let me ask you, Nolan, another piece of this, because you've got you're there, you've got your ear to the ground. What is it like to be where you are right now? Right, like you talked before we hit record on this. You said, "Hey, we might get interrupted by an air raid." You're a brilliant writer, and you're able to describe with tremendous color what it's like. So, can you talk through a little bit more about like what it's like, where you are, and what you've seen? And also, this is a tough one, but if I were Ukrainian, I would want to bulldoze Moscow. Right, I would. I'd want to hang Putin from a bridge. I'd want to bulldoze Moscow. I would not want to stop. And I'm kind of vexed by this. I don't know what the right word is. Patronizing, like elitist, uppity. I don't know what word we use. Idea that Ukraine should just be satisfied with some kind of marginal pullout and just hope that Putin, drops dead in the bathroom. Like we spent 20 years hunting down Bin Laden, right? I mean, and this is on a scale like we've never seen. So can you talk to that a little bit? Because I feel like if I were in Ukraine, I'd want to go all the way, and I'd want to hunt him down and get him and get everybody else. And that seems like justice. And maybe it's that the Ukrainians are so strategic and smart that they're saying, all right, let's get the victory first, and then we'll get to justice after that. But maybe you can unpack those two things. What is it like there, and really, what do Ukrainians want to see, after this phase?
Yeah, well, I'll take the second part of that first. I first came to Ukraine in 2014, and right after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, that's when Russia invaded Crimea and then invaded Eastern Ukraine. And a lot of people like to call it a civil war in Eastern Ukraine after 2014 or whatever. No, Russian regular army units were in Eastern Ukraine. It was an invasion. But for the last until February 24th, 2022, Ukraine was fighting for its freedom. Now Ukraine is fighting for its survival. And I think that's one thing that, if you ask what Americans might be missing, why some Americans might say, oh, why doesn't Ukraine just sign a peace deal with Russia? Like they lost some land, whatever, move on, end the war, save lives. Well, the fact is there's a lot of Ukrainians living behind that front line of Russia's invasion. And after we've seen the murder, the genocide, the raping, the plunder, Ukrainians are totally unwilling to just condemn maybe millions of their fellow citizens to living under this brutal occupation. They don't want to do that. For them, it's a moral duty to liberate their fellow citizens. So I think for many Ukrainians, this is a war for their survival, and they see the Russian threat as a threat that's existed for generations in this country, and they perceive this war as an opportunity to once and for all gain their freedom, push Russia back, and chart their course with a westward trajectory to become part of the West, become part of Europe, and to put their Russian past behind them once and for all. They see this as their moment to establish themselves as a sovereign country, a democracy free from Russian overlordship. So this, to the Ukrainians, is an existential fight that will determine their country's future. And that's why they're not willing to just throw up their hands and quit and sign a peace deal, because they want to survive. They want their country to survive, and they want to stop this wholesale slaughter of their people. You look at images of what's going on in Bakhmut, Mariupol, what happened here on the outskirts of Kyiv. It's hard to find the right words to describe it, but there's really no other parallel besides what, the Nazis did in World War II. It's just a wholesale slaughter of the Ukrainian people. And I think it fuels the Ukrainian people's rage, but also the determination to not take the easy way out, but to see this war through to its conclusion the conclusion, which will guarantee that their children, their grandchildren, won't have to fight this war again, that this will be the end of it. I think that's what drives Ukrainians. As far as life here, like what I alluded to, what I kind of mentioned when we began, I had previously my experience in war zones, as a special operations pilot in Iraq and Afghanistan. You get used to the, indirect fire alerts, you get used to the dangers. As a war correspondent, I've reported from Iraq, Afghanistan, and here in Ukraine, and you get used to the danger to yourself, and that's something that, with experience and good training, you learn to deal with. But there's really no way to ever prepare for being in a war zone, to be facing lethal dangers with your wife beside you. Mm-hmm. And my wife, I kind of perceived that this full-scale war was going to happen. So I originally had her leave Ukraine on February 1st, prior to the full-scale invasion. But then she came back to Kyiv this summer. And then on the morning of October 10th, when Russia bombarded Kyiv with cruise missiles, one of which landed just a few blocks away from where I am right now. Mm. And we were sleeping in the morning, and the walls shook, the windows rattled, our cat ran under our bed, and car alarms were going off outside. And we both woke up and like, what the hell was that? And then another explosion, and then another. And I just grabbed my wife's arm, ran outside, ran to the bomb shelter while explosions were thundering outside, not knowing if one was going to hit near us. And the level of fear and terror and anxiety when you're in a war zone with your family is something that I think many American veterans probably have not experienced. And it really adds just a whole nother level of fear that I had never experienced when my own life was on the line. But it's truly extraordinary. You go through this moment, right? This moment of just not knowing if you're going to die at any moment while the drones are exploding overhead, or missiles or whatever. And then the all clear alert will sound, and people inside the bomb shelter, and those people inside the bomb shelter are kids who are supposed to be at school, old people, young couples, you name it, all spectrums of society are down there. And when the all clear sounds, they walk upstairs, the kids go to school, parents go back to work, life goes on. I'll go to the gym, we'll go grocery shopping, not knowing, like at any moment, the air raid alert can sound again, and there could be Russian missiles on their way. And it's just this crazy way of life that, we often say to each other, carpe diem, and it adds, that saying, the Latin saying, seize the day. It has a new resonance now, because in these moments between the attacks, you rush to go see the dentist, to get your shopping done, to go to the gym. You rush to get all these things done because you don't know when the next attack is going to happen. And so it's just, it's just a surreal surreal way to live. Mm. The only analogy I can think of are stories of London during the Blitz in the 1940s. But there is this incredible strength among the Ukrainian people to carry on. And I have to say that despite the fear, despite the terror of these attacks, that, Russia's attacks against these civilian infrastructure sites and against urban, the cities with these missile and drone strikes, it has definitely hardened, reinforced Ukrainians, the civilian population's desire to resist. Mm-hmm. There's actually a recent poll where, the number of Ukrainians, the percentage of Ukrainians who are willing to make territorial concessions for peace with Russia, 82% were against territorial concessions in May. 85% are against it now. So in the intervening, half of year during these missile and drone strikes, Ukrainians are now less willing to make territorial concessions for peace with Russia. So it's had the opposite effect that I think Russia wanted.
Well, and their heroism is calcifying, and the unity is calcifying, and Americans have this this strange elitism where they think that what's okay for us is not okay for others, or vice versa. Like, we wouldn't be okay with just giving up Maine or Florida or California. and enduring this kind of barrage on a regular basis. So we can't assume that the Ukrainians would be either. I want to ask you, Nolan, and you've generously agreed to stick around. For our Patreon members, you're going to get a little bit of extra content special with Nolan coming up after this. You can flip over to Patreon. Thank you to all our Patreon members for supporting this work. Nolan, I want to ask you to talk about Zelensky, because he came here right before Christmas, and it was one of the most moving, important things I've ever seen. I think his leadership has been, I almost don't have the words, but it's spectacular and so artful and so compelling. But can you talk about what that looked like over there? Was it just another day for Zelensky going to another world leader? We had this vision of Pelosi with the Ukrainian flag, him meeting with Biden, walking in fatigues basically. And, some folks in the media were criticizing him, saying, he should have worn a suit. And I thought it was actually a brilliant political move, because he looked like you look right now. He looked like guys and gals that I served with in Iraq and Afghanistan, but on a much bigger stage. Can you talk about what that whole thing meant, in the historical context, but also for people in those bomb shelters?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, to touch on on Zelensky's attire,
yeah.
Everybody, I interviewed dozens of civilians and soldiers about Zelensky's historic speech before Congress, and every single one of them said that they were so relieved that he showed up wearing his fatigues, rather than a suit, because that symbolizes the fact that, life has been disrupted here, right? People don't wear suits. It's war, a full-scale war for this country's survival. And so I think to the Ukrainian people, which is the audience I think he intended with his clothing, was that, I'm still your wartime president. I'm not going to forget the fact that while I'm here in Washington, you are still suffering under missile attacks. You're still out there in the trenches fighting for our country's freedom and survival. So I think that it was actually, it really hit the right note with the Ukrainian people. And I think with the overwhelming majority of Americans too. President Zelensky's visit to Washington was an enormous morale boost for the Ukrainian people. And so I think that, in this war, Zelensky has basically two major objectives, apart from victory. But one is to continue the supply of Western military aid, which is essential to Ukraine's war effort, but it's also to maintain national morale. I mean, this is a tough war. And I think that, for those of us who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, this war, it's very different than what we experienced, because, we would go to war and then come back to a country that was basically moving on like life was normal, But in this war, it touches every part of society. Everybody, every soldier on the front line has a family back somewhere hiding in bomb shelters under Russian missile and drone attacks. Every corner, every inch of life in Ukraine has been affected by this war. And so for that reason, Zelensky's heroic leadership has been essential to Ukraine's ability to sustain the fight and to turn the war in its favor. I know for a fact that in the first, opening month of the war, all the soldiers with whom I spoke here in Kyiv, who put up that heroic defense of the city, without a doubt, every single one of them said that if Zelensky had left Kyiv after the initial invasion, Kyiv would have fallen. His decision to stay here galvanized his troops, inspired them to dig in their heels, hold their ground, and save the capital city, which effectively saved Ukraine's existence as a sovereign nation. So yeah, and I think, from my perspective as an American, when you see all the cynicism in politics these days, all these blowhards who go on social media and act like they're heroic because they're going to tweet some snarky insult on social media, I think it blows their mind when they see somebody with physical courage, a leader who had enough commitment to his values to actually risk his life and to protect those values, to protect his country, not for gain, not for money, not for personal advancement, not for glory, to save his country, President Zelensky was willing to risk his life. And I think that just it's like a blinking 404 not found in a lot of our
Yeah.
politicians
Yeah.
because they look at that, they just don't get it. They have to, they in their mind, they cannot possibly conceive the notion that a president or a lawmaker would actually act according to principle and not for some cynical gain, like adding more Twitter followers or this or that. It just doesn't make sense to them. And so they
Yeah.
don't believe it. So they make up these other stories about him trying to make money, pay for his wife's shopping trips, whatever. It's all bullshit.
Yeah.
But it just reflects the fact that I think, in a lot of ways, our political establishment has become so cynical that we just don't understand this heroism when it's right there in our face. And I think that I hope that his leadership, and I know that, history will be the judge, and what Zelensky has done will certainly outlast the pettiness of the moment. But I hope it does inspire us because, God forbid, one day our country is facing a fight as existential as the one Ukraine is facing now. I hope we have a leader like Zelensky who is willing to put principle before personal advancement and do what's right for the country, like Zelensky has for Ukraine.
Here, here. Is Florida your home state?
It is Sarasota, Florida. That's my
There's
hometown.
some leadership voids down there, and I wish you would run for office or you would serve in government. We'd be lucky to have your perspective and your vision and your words. I mean, you have such a powerful way of articulating not just what's happening, but the moral imperative of what we're seeing. I asked you last week over Twitter for some recommendations on ways people could help. You recommended for me Ukrainian aid ops that I tweeted about for my birthday. I said, save the flowers and the tweets and donate to some Ukrainian charities. You also gave me another great one, which was signmyrocket.com. And
Absolutely.
you were going to, before we got started, you showed a photo of a rocket that you put together. So the way this works is you
Yeah.
can actually have an artillery shell signed with anything you want and sent to Russia with love. And it's signmyrocket.com. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But do you want to share that one with us, Nolan?
Yeah. So it's I'm sure everybody's familiar with the famous retort by the Ukrainian defenders of Snake Island when the Russian warship asked them to surrender. They said, "Russian warship, go fuck yourself." And so to help my family, as a Christmas present to my family for the holiday, I had I don't know if it's reversed here or
No,
not,
we
but
got it. If you're
go
watching
fuck
on video,
yourselves
if
from the
you're not watching
Petersons.
on video, it's a good time to go over to YouTube and subscribe and watch these interviews on YouTube. But it says, can you hold up one more time, Noah? It says, go fuck yourselves from the Petersons. And that's going to, the Russian front with love from Nolan. Dude, let me ask you one last question. And then again, thankfully you're going to stay over for Patreon members. Um, you got to stay there. Like these stories of like Vietnam vets, and I think like even after World War II, folks who married someone and stayed in France, right? I mean, it's for me, I've said this before, I feel like Ukraine is more American than America right now. And I live in New York for a lot of reasons, but because I feel like much of it represents the best of what this country can be. And I've lived in other places. But for you in your heart, is it going to be hard to go back to America? It was hard for me to come back to America after being in Iraq, but for you and your family, I mean, maybe you don't know yet, but what are you thinking? Are you going to stay there?
I think my wife and I will make America our home eventually. I think that I've been here for almost a decade now covering the war. And I think it's important to come home and to not, to transmit these stories to Americans, but also I hope to um, help prepare our country for this new era of threats that we face. Our generation of wars, 9/11 wars are over, and we're in a very dangerous world right now. And if my experiences here in Ukraine over the last decade can do anything, whether it be help prepare civilians, help leverage the attributes of our veteran community to contribute in a time of crisis, or to impart lessons I've learned from the battlefield to help our military prepare for the next war, it would be an honor to be of service to my country based on what I've learned over here. But it's going to be so hard. I'll never fully leave. At most, I'll probably divide my time between the United States and Ukraine because half my family lives here now. And I think, something that many veterans can appreciate is when you leave military service, particularly if you've deployed, when you enter civilian life, it's very common to feel kind of alone. And I think in this age of social media too, it exacerbates this sense of loneliness. And when you leave the military, you lose this sense of tribe, this sense of purpose, this sense of identity that is really unique, I think, to modern society. And so when I first came to Ukraine in 2014, as a combat veteran, I came here and I felt like every person I met was me.
Mm,
Sometimes I remember going to grad school after I left the military in America. I just felt so out of place. Like I just was speaking a different language with my fellow students and with other civilians. And sometimes it felt like civilian life like was living like in a foreign country. But coming here to Ukraine, I felt at home because everybody here believes so strongly in freedom and democracy and everything our country stands for, and they're willing to fight for it. They're willing to die for it. And I felt this instant commonality, this instant connection with the Ukrainian people, and it really inspired me. And it kind of re-energized, or it sort of replaced that sense of
mm.
purpose and community that I thought I had lost when I left the military.
Well, you're truly a heroic voice. You're the best kind of independent American. You have that great spirit of revolution and rebellion and the future and all the things that we look for in our country and we root for in others. And I'm going to put this down as a marker. Maybe one day Wes Moore will be president. I've said this before. It could happen. You'd make a hell of an ambassador to Ukraine. One day you
I
would be
would
a
do that.
brilliant American ambassador to Ukraine. If this thing comes full circle like it could, and maybe one day, my family and yours can have dinner in Kyiv and we'll celebrate the great
Really.
victory. But there's a great day in the future where this could come full circle and you could be continuing to serve both sides of this. I'm really grateful for your friendship, for your leadership, for your voice, for your work. And to everyone that you touch and everyone that you give voice to, my friend. You've been really such an important leader during this time. And I hope you'll come back again a lot this year. We can continue these conversations. And until then, I hope you stay safe. And Slava Ukraini.
Героям slava. And thank you for having me on. It means
How
a
do you
lot.
say how do you say stay vigilant in Ukrainian? Do you have any idea?
You say "Будьте осторожны," be careful.
Bucha Dishloja. That's my mutilated version. Excellent. Okay. Bucha Dishloja. Thank you, my friend.
All right. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.